Hey everybody, welcome. This is our lesson on Chinese influence on Japan, and it takes us to our earlier period in the classical and post-classical age of 600 to 1450. So our key learning objectives and what we're reviewing today are a number of things. One, we're going to go and explain the systems of government and how they were employed by Chinese dynasties over time. Explain the effects particularly, and here's our main point, of Chinese cultural traditions in East Asia over time, and then also the effect of economic innovations of Chinese economy over. So what we're going to start off with first is a quick review on a key historical term, and that's the term cultural diffusion and what that might look like. So if you could, go ahead and take some time, and if you click on the student assignment, the student response sheet, there's a set of part one introductory questions. So at this point, go ahead and pause the video and answer these three questions. All right, once you have completed these three questions, let's go ahead and move on. This will be part of the short answer question response set. So the first part is a quick historical introduction. Where we want to be taken to is the Han Dynasty of the classical Chinese period, right around the time bordering the birth of Christ. And when we look at classical civilizations, we want to take a look at the term classical, which is usually referred to a great time of cultural and technological development, so impactful that its ideas will impact the region for not only centuries to come, but even all the way up to the modern period. Okay? But like most Chinese dynasties, uh, after the fall of the Han, China was entered into a series and really centuries of various warring aristocracies fighting for control of the entire region. China was not reunified until one of these regions, known as the Sui, was able to bring the state back together in the 6th century, but it didn't last long. But during the time that they were in control, they were able to do a number of things. One is to be able to connect the north and the south together through the reinstitution of the Grand Canal, particularly connecting both the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze River in the south. This also meant military expansion into the north with great influence into the Korea Peninsula, forcing the local dynasty, the Silla kings, to pay tribute to the Tang, which the governments of China have done for centuries to be able to exact taxes and tribute from lesser states as an illustration of their dominance, but then also to move into the north, whereby they are now connecting with the establishing Silk Road's trade routes. Furthermore, under the Tang Dynasty of the 7th to the 10th century, they were able to reestablish a major road network system of horses, inns, couriers, whereby all the provinces could connect with the capital at Xi'an in about 8 days. They hired about almost 10,000 runners just for the sole purpose of bringing seafood into the inner capital at Xi'an as well. The Tang also was able to break apart the power of the regional warlords by redistributing property and lands through what is known as the equal field system, whereby they could pass on about 1/5 of the property. The rest would be redistributed by the Tang state for their own control. Okay? And lastly, probably most importantly, is the reestablishment of the merit bureaucracy system. Okay? What that meant was a slow return of Confucianism, and eventually, because of the challenge of Buddhism, Neo-Confucianism the key belief set and the main way by which law is exhibited in China at this time. So what our key connections are for this particular time period is how these ideas will eventually find their way from China through Korea and by the 7th century into Japan, particularly through the work of the Yamato clan, which is actually able to unify the various regional aristocracies in Japan, led by a man by the name of Prince Shotoku. And as a result of this, we have all sorts of customs that will enter into Japan from China at this time. And that's what this particular assignment is about. Okay. Hey everybody, welcome back. This is the next part for the lesson Chinese influence on Japan. You should on the third column where it says how these influences became part of Japanese culture. So what we're going to do is to take a look at how each part of these Chinese customs were implemented and in some ways changed as a result of going into Japanese. With that, we're going to take a look at and go through your graphic organizer from image A all the way to image I. Okay. The first image that we're going to look at is obviously image A. Okay. And the various Chinese influence that you see. One, many of the belief sets from the Buddha himself were retained, and particularly the use of temples and shrines as the primary means of study and also of worship. We also see statues of the Buddha and also various artworks utilized to decorate shrines in various temples. And not only that, but the cross-legged meditation style in the statues was used particularly by the Chan or Buddhist. And as it was applied to Japanese culture, coming in and from missionaries in establishing monasteries in the 6th century from India, China to Korea to Japan, and then particularly in mixing with the veneration of nature in Japan, and particularly the natural belief set of Shinto, it produced what is known as Zen or Chan Buddhism. Okay, it's not just missionaries, but we also have Prince Shotoku himself sending students to China to learn things and skills such as weaving, medicine, shipbuilding, and astronomy. And in doing so, they brought Buddhism back to Japan. So image A should be Buddhism. All right. Not only that, one last point is that the rigorous meditation styles of the Zen Buddhists became very popular later on with the samurai warriors of medieval Japanese custom. Move on to image B, and image B is regarding Confucianism. Okay, the belief whereby there is the respect through hierarchy, whereby the needs of the family is greater than the individual, and that children should be deferential to parents, which also means that if you are a follower of the state, you should be deferential to the emperor authorities around you. And this will become a part of Japanese culture in that Confucianism would be introduced with Buddhism. So these two competing cultural influences from China will in the end be brought to Japan, and in a lot of ways they would be merged together. Right? The emphasis of family, honor, and respect and obedience would be embraced to create a new Japanese emperor that would over time be at least culturally one of the most important people in Japan. Sometimes not necessarily in regards to real political power. We'll see that with the shogunate period and also the imperial Japanese period. But in terms of veneration for an emperor, this is where image C. Okay, image C is about the implementation of government, okay, whereby, again, this emperor was given authority to rule, and there's a notion of divine right, where the spiritual world has given authority to the emperor as a whole. And not only that, but the imperial rule through the use of a strong bureaucracy. Not only that, but the implementation of special class privileges. And as it is implemented into Japanese culture, what was created by Prince Shotoku using the fundamentals of the Chinese bureaucratic system is to create a new constitution. It's known as the 17-article constitution, which will be based on moral and ethical behavior, whereby these key officials would be advised to be as fair and as good as possible. Much of this will be based upon Confucian and Buddhist values, as it is said that harmony above all should be valued and quarrels, avoided at all costs. And in this particular system, it would be based upon the merit bureaucracy, whereby there is a 12-level ranking system that would be based upon merit. In a lot of ways, very similar to what we see in the Chinese government, where you would take a test to see how well you do and your particular skill. And so this particular bureaucracy, in particular, you can see the color hats and the clothing that these bureaucrats would wear that would determine their particular rank. We move on to our next image, and that would be image D. As you see, the architecture of China would be implemented with those in Japan. We see in China palaces, temples, and large buildings that were raised upon these stone platform foundations. And when we look at the roofs, the curved roofs would become the most prominent feature in Chinese architecture. Okay. Oftentimes, particularly the Buddhists would create pagodas for use of meditation teaching. It would become a part of Japanese culture in that many of these designs that were used in some of the major Chinese cities would become the model of the new Japanese imperial capital at Nara in the 8th century. Hey, the biggest difference is that Japan is geographically tighter. There are fewer plains, and so the cities themselves would be a bit smaller, and many of the modifications would be done for space limitations. Image E would be the Chinese written language for the usage of characters to express ideas, oftentimes made of more than a single stroke. And in doing so, these characters would be created by both straight and curved lines. Okay? And each one of these is a pictogram. They each will represent a particular word. There is quite a difference, even though you have a similar written language. How it's implemented would be quite different than in Chinese. Okay? The use of Chinese characters, also known as kanji, was introduced again by many of these missionaries and traders in the 6th century. And how the Japanese would adapt to it is that these symbols won't just simply represent a word, but instead they become a form of phonetics, hiragana and katakana script. Okay? And thus you actually had multisyllabic terms in Japanese. Okay? One of the creations as a result of this written language, because of the use of syllables, is what is known as the tanka form of poetry, whereby you had 31 different syllables, and they would be matched up in 5 different lines, whereby you had 5 syllables in the first line, 7 in the second, 5 in the third, and in the fourth and fifth there would be 7 syllables. In a lot of ways, the tanka was the predecessor to a form of poetry that you guys have probably all been taught at some point, the haiku. We move on to image F, and image F is the creation of cities and new cities. Okay. This is something that the ancient Romans did as well, but the creation of cities in these squared forms and in terms of the right feng shui, many of these cities would face south. The central and southern parts of the cities would be occupied by imperial buildings, and there would be usually temples and shrines that are placed at strategic locations these particular cities. And it became part of Japanese culture in the implementation of the city of Nara, which again, the imperial capital of Japan would be a copy of the Chinese city of Chang'an, today's Xi'an. Okay. In some of these imperial cities, especially in times of unification, there were no need for high walls that the Chinese city. Image G would be attire and dress. Okay. Um, Citizens of wealth usually would have silk clothing. More common citizens would wear cotton. And there were particular forms of dress that Chinese nobles would use with special designs and special colors that would indicate their particular status. Okay? Not only that, but wealthy men and women would often find themselves carrying fans and parasols out as well. In many ways, this would become the form of dress in Japan as well. By the 8th century, many of the upper class Japanese, particularly of aristocratic families, would start to see what was going on from the Tang dynasty, and they would start to dress in the exact same way as a number of Chinese aristocrats as well. And if you go on the streets, what you wore would usually reflect both your class and also your rank as well. Image H, okay, would be painting. And many of the inks and watercolor paintings that were done on these horizontal scrolls in China, whereby a lot of times you have these beautiful landscapes that would reflect the river valleys in China. Were seen in Chinese art. Much of the art is monochromatic, so again, if it's blue, you see tints and hints of blue, like you see in that image right there. Again, landscapes and nature were usually the this would become a part of Japanese culture in what is known as the Yamato style of art. In a similar way, horizontal scrolls with very strong colors. This is an image from one of the most famous literary pieces, The Tale of Genji, in Japan. Uh, Very much so, like in China, nature and the reverence of nature was formed in these particular arts, but we actually do see a number of people, which isn't usually in Chinese art, that would be implemented in the system. Okay. Furthermore, we go on to image I, and lastly, the music from Chinese influences, whereby instruments were usually classified in China from the materials from which they were made. A popular instrument in the court was known as the qin, which is actually what you saw in the video and probably heard from it if you were able to access the video. Okay. Not only that, but forms of music were written on paper, another Chinese innovation from and if you can hear the music, this is one of the Japanese renditions using the qin.